This is Unit 9, Section 2 and 3, looking at micro and macro evolution. So, we learned in the last section that evolution basically means a change in species over time. The species is going to become better. This is not an individual change. So, if you use the word, he really evolved as a person, one individual does not evolve. The evolution requires the entire species to evolve. And so what we're looking at when we look at species evolution is the frequency of different genes in that population. The genes are shifting. Maybe there are more of a certain gene that aids in camouflage and less of some other trait, and then that would be an evolution of the species. The species is changing as far as all the genetics inside of it. Okay, so there's two different types. Microevolution is done on a small scale in a short period of time, and this is just change in gene frequency. So, for example, in humans, the fact that red hair is becoming less and less common in the human population is a microevolution thing. We're just seeing a shift in the traits in our population. The human species is becoming taller in general. If you just look at the median height in humans, we are a lot taller than we used to be 100 years ago. And macroevolution is huge changes that are going to take a long period of time and that results in a new species. So eventually your species changes enough to where it's not the same as it used to be. So the species changes enough so that you have to categorize it as a whole new species because it is now so different from the original. So, for example, Homo sapiens, which is what we are, our ancestors, Homo habilis, which came right before us, which are the tool makers, their brain size, their skull structure, the way they walked and everything was so different from us that we eventually had to rename the species because it was so different. Something changed to create a very different species. Okay, so microevolution is that change in gene frequency in the population. We're looking at a gene pool. So we look at all the members of the population. So let's say we're looking at the gene pool of America. We have genes for all kinds of traits in America, right? We're a very diverse place. So all kinds of different genes are in this gene pool. And there are some mutations that are helpful. Maybe just mutations that help with not getting cancer or something like that. And then there's mutations that are harmful, like sickle cell anemia that we talked about. And that can, in America, that's kind of harmful, but in Africa, we talked about how it prevents against malaria, so it becomes a really good trait. So that's why it kind of stays in that gene pool, because it's providing something good. So a beneficial mutation is called an adaptation. Okay, so you have an adaptation to help you survive. So camouflage is an adaptation to help you survive. Okay, and then mutations, just in general, if they're bad, hopefully die out in the gene pool because those don't really come along. And we talked about last unit how these mutations are typically recessive because that's the best way for them to hide out and get passed along. Okay, so this brings us to the term natural selection, which means that if you're more suited to your environment, you'll leave more offspring than those that are not. So, if you have a good camouflage, like a snow rabbit that's white, you're going to be passing on more of those traits to your offspring than a dark bird rabbit, because in the Arctic habitat, white is good. And dark means you're going to be spotted by a predator and eaten and probably not pass on your genes. Okay? So that's kind of the main idea. Nature chooses who lives and who dies. The other side of that is if you are a dominant male, like in the hippos fight to the death or close to it to be the one hippo that gets to mate in a huge group of females. And so the fiercest one is going to win that competition and then pass on his genes with all of those females. And those hippos are going to be the best. They're going to be super strong. And that weak hippo doesn't even get to mate. He gets outcasted from the group. So those genes get passed along. So the same kind of idea. Nature is choosing which genes get to be passed along. So let's say you have two kinds of snails, the thin-shelled and the thick-shelled. Well, if you have a predator like a crab that is going around, obviously is going to favor one type of prey. So in this case, he is favoring the narrow shells. It's easier for him to grasp in his pinchers. So he's going to go and eat all the narrow shelled ones. So what's going to happen to that gene pool over time? You're eventually just going to get more of the wide-shelled ones, right? The narrow-shelled ones are just going to die out and not survive and pass on their genes. Okay, here's another scenario. So you have two kinds of beetles, dark ones and light ones. So white ones could be albino or something like that, right? In this case, they're on a dark background, like a tree. Okay, so bird obviously finds the white ones. They're easier to catch. And eventually, that gene pool changes so that those white ones are no longer part of the gene pool. And the darker ones are going to win out and become more frequent. So the genes that are becoming more frequent are causing the species to be better. So, what made one beetle more fit than the other? It wasn't that they were faster or anything like that. It's just the color of their exoskeleton. So just the color. What's doing the selecting? In this case, it's the bird that decides who lives and dies. And how does beetle population change? Basically, the exoskeleton color got darker because the white genes didn't survive, didn't pass on their traits. Okay, so microevolution is just that change in gene frequency. Macro is going to create a whole new species, and that's called speciation. So, the definition of species is organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring together. So, for example, a horse and a donkey, not the same species. When they mate, they produce a mule. A mule is not fertile. Mules cannot have babies. So that's why we know that they're different species. Okay? So there's many different ways that new species can form. So we're going to talk about the three main mechanisms. The first is geographic isolation. So for example, Pangea splitting apart and drifting to different areas of the world. Well, now they're in new climates and there's new pressures because of some kind of new plant life or whatever that comes along. So they change to fit their new environment. And that's called allopatric speciation. They're changing because they're in a new environment and they have to kind of change based on the new pressures there. Okay. So that's geographic. Sometimes it's simple as being separated by a body of water or a mountain range or something like that too. The founder's effect. So a few individuals leave their main ecosystem, go to a new one, and eventually they become different. So we found this in the Galapagos Islands. They left Ecuador. These, like the birds, left Ecuador and went to these islands and settled, and then they just became so different from the ones in Ecuador because they're different islands. There's different food sources, there's different predators, all kinds of different things that lead you to change differently. And eventually become a new species because you're irrecognizable from the original. Right, the bottleneck effect basically is when your population crashes. So you have this healthy population, then there's some kind of disaster that causes your population to just go down to a few individuals. So now there's not much diversity in your gene pool, and then that causes you to change quite rapidly because now there's just maybe a handful left of you, and so that is going to cause you to change pretty fast. So for example, the cheetah population almost went extinct because of poaching at one point, and so basically all the cheetahs that exist today are cousins to each other genetically. There's two kinds of models for how we can see that macroevolution happen. And Darwin thought that it was more like a gradual change, that we would find fossils of all these in-betweens of all of these species. Really what we see is something called punctuated equilibrium, meaning we're going to go for a long time with not much changing, just little shifts here and there in the gene pool, and then all of a sudden something is going to happen, like a natural disaster, a flood, an asteroid, something like that, and it's going to cause the species to have to change quite dramatically, and that's when these new species are going to form. So this is what we see in the fossil record. We don't see gradual change. We see big spurts in physical features, and then that leads us to say, okay, this is a new species now because it is so different than the original. So you can see here's this butterfly, and then something changes where it had to morph in some way. This mutation caused this different color change. Maybe these were separated by some kind of barrier or something. So then this becomes a whole new species. This species is continuing on, and it happens again. So now we have three different species of butterfly from this original one because of some kind of pressure from the environment. And that is it for section 2 and 3.